Welcome to our sleepy journey into the past. Tonight, we explore why being rich in the year 985 could not buy everything. So, find your comfortable spot, whether in a cozy bed or your favorite chair. Let your shoulders relax and take a slow, deep breath, letting the day's worries drift away. Where are you tuning in from? What time is it in your part of the world? Is it evening, or are you just beginning your day with a surprisingly calm history lesson? No judgment either way. If you find these quiet travels relaxing, a simple follow or subscribe ensures we can meet here again for our next story. Now, allow your mind to settle. Imagine you are a powerful landowner in the year 985. You own vast fields and chests of silver coins. From a window in your stone hall, you watch laborers stop to pass a water skin between them, their faces lined with effort. You have more wealth than any of them could dream of. But you know that true safety, perfect health, and lasting peace are not things you can simply purchase. In the year 985, in the kingdom of Wessex in southern England, a man's worth was not counted first in silver coins. Before all else, it was measured by the earth itself. We begin our time with Thegn Leofric, a local lord of some importance, not in a grand hall, but in a damp field, as the morning mist rose in thin wisps from the ground. His breath clouded in the cool air, mingling with that of the men and boys who followed him. The wealth that mattered most was under his feet, and on this day in early spring, he would walk its every edge, reasserting a claim not with ink, but with his own presence. This was the foundation of his power, a physical connection to the soil that gave everything else its meaning. The purpose of this solemn procession was a ritual known as beating the bounds. In an age with few written deeds, a person's memory, and the shared memory of the community, was the ultimate record. Leofric began the day at a large, moss-covered stone set deep in the earth near the river, a landmark that had stood for generations. From this starting point, his reeve, a stern and trusted manager named Cynric, unspooled a long, heavy rope. This was a geared, a carefully crafted measuring tool with knots tied at set intervals. Its weight in his hands was a comfort, a tangible link to the order he imposed on the landscape. This yearly act was a public performance, ensuring everyone knew precisely where Leofric's land ended and another's began. The technical process was deliberate and methodical. Cynric and another man would pull the geared taut, its length defining 1 unit of measurement. Leofric would watch, his eyes following the line from the starting stone toward a distant gnarled oak tree on a low ridge. Once the measurement was made, the men would pace forward, lay the rope down again, and repeat the process. They were not just measuring, they were performing an act of memory for all to witness. The slow, rhythmic pacing was a physical reinforcement of ownership, far more powerful to the people of this time than a piece of parchment locked away in a chest. Their progress was slow, dictated by the terrain and the need for precision. Following the men was a small group of village boys, their eyes wide with a mixture of boredom and importance. Their task was the most critical of all: to remember. Historical accounts describe how, at key boundary markers, a distinctive tree, a sharp bend in the stream, or a pile of carefully placed stones, the boys would be given a sharp tug on the ear or a rap on the head. Now, this might sound a bit harsh to our modern ears, but the logic was rooted in practicality. The brief sting of pain was meant to forge a lasting memory, associating the physical feeling with the specific location. One day, these boys would be the old men who could stand in a field and say with absolute certainty, "This is the boundary. I remember it from my youth." The very materials of this process were chosen for their permanence, reflecting a deep desire for stability that could last generations. The boundary markers were not random. They were immense stones dragged into place long ago, or ancient oak trees whose roots ran deeper than any living man's memory. These objects resisted the decay of seasons and the shifting of soil. Furthermore, the land itself told a story of its value. As the group moved from the low-lying fields, the heavy, dark clay clung to their boots. This soil was ideal for growing wheat, the backbone of their diet. Higher up, the earth became lighter and sandy, a loam better suited for grazing the sheep that provided the wool for which this kingdom was famous. This simple organization of labor was a mirror of their society. Leofric, as the Thegn, did not pull the rope himself, but his presence gave the event its authority. He was the director of the ritual. Cynric, his reeve, represented management, the skilled hand responsible for the technical execution of the measurement. The other men provided the necessary muscle, while the boys were the living record, the future guarantors of the boundaries being paced out before them. This hierarchy was understood by all, a natural order that defined their world from the king down to the lowest field hand. Each person had a role, and the stability of the manor depended on everyone fulfilling it. The procession took much of the morning, a slow circuit around the lands that sustained the entire community. The only sounds were the low commands of Cynric, the squelch of leather boots in the wet earth, and the calls of birds greeting the new day. They passed through damp woods where the smell of last year's decaying leaves was strong, and across open fields where the first green shoots of wild garlic were pushing through the soil. For Leofric, this was more than an inspection. It was a renewal of his bond with the land he held in trust from the king, and a reminder of his duty to protect it for his own heirs. This reliance on collective memory and physical ritual underscores the immense, unmovable value of land. Unlike silver, which could be stolen, or livestock, which could fall to disease, the land was constant. It was the source of food, of wood for fuel and building, and of grazing for animals. However, its ownership required this constant, active defense through public display. A man's wealth was quite literally rooted in the ground he could walk, measure, and defend against all rivals. His claim was only as strong as the community's willingness to remember and uphold it. As they completed the circle and returned to the great stone by the river, a quiet understanding settled over the group. The boundaries were reaffirmed for another year. Leofric gave a slight nod to Cynric, a gesture of a job well done. The reeve began coiling the heavy, damp gird, his movements efficient and practiced. The boys, their ears perhaps still ringing slightly, were already beginning to chatter amongst themselves, their part in the serious work of men now finished. They had witnessed and learned, storing the shape of their world in their minds. The sun was higher now, and the lingering dampness of the morning was beginning to recede. Leofric stood for a moment, looking out over the fields. The dark, plowed earth lay ready for seed, promising a future harvest. His wealth was not an abstract number, but this living, breathing landscape, defined by memory and held together by the efforts of his people. It was a solid, tangible reality, but one that required constant vigilance and the careful management of both the land and the people who lived upon it. Such careful methods of marking territory and embedding boundaries into collective memory reveal a foundational human impulse. The need to define one's place in the world, to draw lines upon the earth and have them respected, is a pattern that repeats in cultures across time. It is the very beginning of creating order out of the wild, a process that continues to shape our societies even today. The boundaries of the land, once walked and confirmed, represented a fixed and foundational wealth. Yet the true pulse of Leofric's prosperity was not found in silent earth and stone, but in the noisy, breathing heart of the manor. Beyond the main hall, in the pens and barns, a different kind of accounting took place daily. Here, wealth was mobile, vulnerable, and required constant attention. The lowing of oxen waiting for their yokes at dawn, the persistent bleating of the sheep flock, and the sharp calls of geese were the sounds of Leofric's living hoard, a form of capital that could grow through birth or vanish through sickness overnight. His reeve, Cynric, met him by the largest sheepfold, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the concerns of the seasons. Together, they assessed the flock, their focus not on the number of animals alone, but on their quality. The process of animal husbandry was a slow, generational craft. They examined the ewes for the fineness and length of their fleece, a practical form of selective breeding aimed at producing the best possible wool. This wool was not merely for local use, it was the single most valuable export of the kingdom, a tangible thread connecting their small manor to the wider world. Historical accounts indicate that the quality of English wool was already recognized far beyond its shores, making each healthy sheep a contributor to a vast economic network. From the sheepfold, their inspection moved to the granary, a structure that demonstrated a clever technical solution to a persistent problem. The building did not sit on the ground. Instead, it was raised upon a series of squat, mushroom-shaped stone pillars known as staddle stones. This design lifted the timber-framed storehouse well above the damp earth, preventing rot, and the wide stone caps made it nearly impossible for rats and mice to climb up into the grain. The process involved in its construction was straightforward but effective, creating a pocket of dry air that circulated underneath, preserving the harvest. Archaeologists find the remains of these stone supports and the post holes of such granaries often, confirming that this advanced storage technique was a critical piece of manorial technology. It was during this inspection that Cynric pointed to a ewe standing apart from the others, its head low, its breathing shallow. This was the ever-present challenge that no amount of land could prevent. Disease in a flock was a direct and immediate threat, capable of wiping out a year's profit in a matter of weeks. There was no single cure, only a system of pragmatic management. Leofric's immediate instruction was for separation. The sick animal was moved to an isolated pen, far from the others. Such a response demonstrates the active, hands-on nature required to preserve these living assets. The solution attempted was not one of magic, but of practical herbal knowledge passed down through generations. A poultice, a moist mixture of crushed herbs, was prepared from yarrow and broad-leafed plantain, plants that grew wild in the fields and were known for their cleansing properties. The reeve applied the mixture to the animal's nostrils and chest, a hopeful but uncertain remedy. Leofric watched the process, his expression grim. He understood that this was often not enough. The bones of animals found at similar manor sites reveal much about the diet and economy of the period, but they also sometimes show signs of widespread disease, a silent record of these devastating events. When a second sheep showed the same signs the following day, a more difficult decision had to be made. Leofric found himself torn between the hope of saving the animals and the clear danger of letting the sickness spread. To lose two was painful. To lose the whole flock was ruinous. He watched the shepherd's anxious face, seeing the same calculation reflected there. After a long moment of silence, broken only by the sound of the wind against the timber walls of the barn, he gave the quiet command. The two sick animals were to be culled and their bodies burned, a harsh but necessary choice to protect the rest of the herd. This difficult act of preservation underscores a key aspect of wealth in this era. The management of livestock was a complex system of risk mitigation. Historians often debate the overall efficiency of the open field farming and animal care of the time, and while it seems basic to modern eyes, it was in fact a careful balance. The health of the flock depended on the quality of the grazing land, which in turn depended on the weather. A dry summer could mean poor pasture and weaker animals more vulnerable to sickness, creating a fragile chain of cause and effect. The work of protecting this living capital was constant. After the grim task was completed, Leofric and Cynric turned their attention back to the healthy animals, ensuring the water troughs were clean and the fodder was fresh. The labor organization on the manor meant that specific herdsmen were responsible for the day-to-day care, but ultimate responsibility rested with the Thegn. His presence during these tasks reaffirmed his authority and his deep investment in every aspect of the manor's operation. This direct oversight was crucial in a time before written reports and remote management. As the day ended, Leofric stood by the now quiet sheepfold. The remaining animals settled, their soft sounds a comfort after the day's tension. He was still a wealthy man. His fields were secure, and his granary was protected. But the day had been a stark reminder that a significant portion of his fortune was fragile, held in the life of each breathing creature. It was a form of wealth that demanded not just ownership, but constant, vigilant stewardship. Such methods of managing living resources highlight the active and precarious nature of prosperity. It was not a static treasure to be counted, but a dynamic system that had to be defended daily against the unending forces of decay and disease. This constant effort reveals a world where security was earned through relentless diligence and hard choices, not simply inherited.
The wealth of a man like Thegn Leofric was never simply a measure of acreage or the number of sheep in his pens. Following the careful assessment of his living hoard, the true foundation of his standing became clear, not in the quiet of the barns, but in the morning light that touched the small wattle and daub homes of his people. His inheritance was more than soil and beasts. It was a complex web of human lives, each with its own needs, skills, and allegiances. His fortune was bound directly to the arms and backs of the men and women who worked his land, a reality that asserted itself with the rising of every sun. On his estate, society was arranged in clear, understood layers. There were the churls, free peasants who held their own small plots of land by ancient custom. In return for this right, they owed Leofric a certain number of days of labor on his personal fields, known as the domain, and a portion of their own harvest. Below them were the gebers, workers who possessed little more than the clothes they wore. Leofric provided them with a cottage, a strip of land to feed their family, tools, and a pair of oxen. In exchange, their lives were tied to his service, working his land several days a week. It was a system of mutual, though deeply unequal, dependence that formed the very engine of the manor. This interdependence was never more visible than during the spring plowing of the great open field. The heavy clay soil of Wessex required a powerful plow team, ideally 8 oxen yoked together to cut a deep and true furrow. No single churl or geber owned such a team. Most were fortunate to have 2. Consequently, the entire process became a communal undertaking, a carefully negotiated ritual of pooled resources. Families would gather at the edge of the vast unfenced field, their animals stamping and snorting in the cool morning air, their breaths turning to mist. The success of the coming year depended entirely on their ability to work as one. The technical process of forming the team required immense coordination. The reeve, Cynric, moved among the men, his voice a low and constant instruction against the creak of leather and the jingle of harnesses. He would direct the yoking, ensuring the strongest pair of oxen were placed at the front as leaders. The heavy wooden plow, tipped with a share of precious iron, was a shared asset of the village, its weight a testament to the effort required to turn the earth. This method meant that everyone's fortune was linked. A slow team held back the progress of all, and a broken plowshare was a disaster for the entire community. As the long line of animals strained forward, Cynric walked alongside, his eyes fixed on the furrow.
He called out commands to the man guiding the plow handles, ensuring the cut was straight and of an even depth. The rhythmic groan of the unseasoned wood, the strained breathing of the oxen, and the soft tearing sound of the earth became the dominant sounds of the morning. It was a slow, deliberate pace, a testament to the immense power needed to prepare the land for seed. Here, wealth was not a count of silver coins, but the successful coordination of animal power and human skill. This delicate balance, however, was easily disturbed. Trouble began near midday when the team began to falter, the plow veering to one side. A heated exchange erupted between two men, Edric and Ordgar, their voices sharp in the quiet field. Edric's lead ox was stumbling, clearly exhausted or unwell, and Ordgar accused him of bringing a weak animal that jeopardized the entire day's work for everyone. The accusation was serious, as it implied one family was failing to uphold its end of the communal bargain, a failure that could ripple through the village's food supply. The argument quickly drew others in, some siding with Ordgar's frustration, others murmuring sympathy for Edric's plight. Cynric's attempts to restore order were lost in the rising anger. The work ground to a halt. The great 8-ox team stood idle, the plow resting in its half-finished furrow, while the men clustered together, their faces flushed with emotion. The entire economic enterprise of the manor was paused, not by blight or raiders, but by a conflict over a single tired animal. This moment revealed the fragility of the social contract that underpinned Leofric's prosperity. Word of the stoppage reached Leofric in his hall, and he soon appeared at the edge of the field, his presence alone silencing the argument. He did not speak at first, instead walking slowly to the front of the team to inspect Edric's ox. He ran a hand along the animal's flank, noting its labored breathing and the dullness in its eyes. He then turned his gaze to the assembled men, seeing the hardened resentment on Ordgar's face and the quiet desperation on Edric's. His authority rested on his ability to resolve this, to mend the tear in the community's fabric. A part of him knew that custom was on Ordgar's side. A man was expected to bring a healthy animal to the shared work, and failure to do so meant forfeiting his portion of the plowed land for the day. It was a harsh but simple rule. Yet, as he looked at Edric's worn leather shoes and the patched wool of his tunic, Leofric considered the consequences of such a ruling. It would not only shame Edric, but might ruin his family for the year, turning a productive worker into a dependent one. The long-term stability of his workforce felt more valuable than the rigid enforcement of tradition. After a long moment of silence that seemed to stretch across the field, Leofric made his decision. He turned not to the arguing men, but to Cynric. He instructed his reeve to go to his own personal barn and bring one of the domain oxen, a strong, healthy animal, to take the place of Edric's. He then informed Edric that his ox would rest, and that in return for the loan, Edric would owe an extra 2 days of labor during the harvest, a time when every hand was needed. The solution was a compromise. It upheld the principle of obligation while preventing a family's ruin. A visible wave of relief passed through the assembled men. Ordgar gave a short, accepting nod, his grievance addressed. Edric murmured his thanks, his shame replaced with gratitude. Soon the reeve returned with the fresh ox, the team was re-yoked, and the plow once again bit into the dark soil. The sounds of work resumed, the crisis averted, not by a decree of absolute power, but by a careful act of management that preserved both the man and the system. Leofric watched them for a while longer before turning back toward his hall. The dispute was a stark reminder that his lands and herds were worthless without the willing, coordinated labor of his people. His authority was not a static right of inheritance, but something that had to be actively maintained through wisdom and foresight. Wealth, he understood more clearly than ever, was not an accumulation of things, but the stewardship of a living, breathing community. This detailed examination of a single agricultural dispute illuminates the complex social forces that truly governed productivity and power. A lord's ability to command labor was his most essential asset, and its preservation required a deep understanding of human need as much as a knowledge of the land itself. Inside the main hall, the air was still and cool, carrying the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke from the central hearth, where embers glowed a deep, pulsing red. Long shadows stretched from the heavy roof timbers, smoke-blackened from generations of use. The world of growing things, of soil and livestock, was left outside. Here, within these thick wooden walls, another kind of wealth was kept. Leofric moved past the long trestle tables, his footsteps quiet on the packed earth floor. He stopped before a small chest, no larger than a man's footstool, but built with a clear purpose. It was made of dark oak, its surface showing the marks of an adze, and bound with thick straps of black iron, held in place by heavy hammered nails. The latch was not a simple hook, but a complex iron mechanism that required a specific key. With a turn of the heavy iron key, the lock gave a solid, satisfying clank that echoed briefly in the quiet hall. Leofric lifted the heavy lid, the scent of old wood and cold metal rising to meet him. There was no cascade of glittering jewels, no mountain of gold. Instead, nestled on a piece of worn wool, lay a modest collection of silver pennies. In the dim light filtering down from the smoke hole in the roof, they did not shine. They were dull, thin discs of metal, each one slightly different from the next, their edges uneven, and their surfaces stamped with the crude profile of a king. This was not a treasure meant to inspire awe, but a practical tool, a store of value reduced to its most concentrated form. The very appearance of these coins told the story of their creation. Each one began as a small, measured blank of silver, carefully weighed by a craftsman known as a moneyer, who worked only in a town with the king's permission. This moneyer would place the silver blank between two engraved iron dies, one for the front, one for the back, and strike it with a heavy hammer. A single sharp blow was all it took. Because of this method, no two coins were ever identical. Some were struck off-center, others showed faint impressions, and their roundness was a matter of approximation, not precision. This handmade quality was a fundamental aspect of their nature.
Leofric picked up a single penny, feeling its surprising lightness in his palm. He turned it over, his thumb tracing the faint outline of a cross on its reverse. On many of the coins, small, sharp dents known as peck marks were visible. This was the result of a simple but effective process of assaying, or testing the silver's purity. A merchant or a tax collector, upon receiving a coin, might test it with the point of a knife. If the coin were pure silver, the mark would be clean. If it were a cheaper metal, like tin or lead, plated with a thin silver coating, the sharp point would break the surface and reveal the fraud beneath. These little marks were a constant, physical reminder that even this most solid form of wealth carried its own risks and uncertainties. Holding the small piece of silver, Leofric's thoughts drifted back to the troubles of the past seasons. This coin could not have convinced the sickness to leave his sheep flock. 100 such coins could not have persuaded the clouds to release their rain upon the dry summer fields. This metal, for all its perceived value, could not guarantee a good harvest or mend a broken fence. Its power was of a different, more limited kind. It was a solution to a specific set of problems, but entirely useless against the great, fundamental challenges of the land and the sky that governed his existence and the well-being of his people. The true purpose of this silver was to acquire what the manor could not produce, and to satisfy obligations that could not be met with grain or wool. A significant portion was destined for the king's tax collectors, a demand that could only be settled with royal currency. Other coins might be used to purchase a bar of good iron from a traveling merchant, essential for making new plowshares. Salt, a vital substance for preserving meat through the winter, had to be bought from traders who brought it inland from the coastal salt pans. The silver was not a foundation of his power. It was a necessary lubricant for the machinery of his household and his duties as a thegn. Furthermore, a portion of this wealth was owed not to any king or merchant, but to God. The construction of the new stone church required payments to skilled masons, and offerings were expected on holy days. Such contributions were not merely acts of piety, they were public demonstrations of status and a way of securing the community's spiritual health. In this way, the silver in the chest was not entirely his own. It was subject to the demands of his king, the needs of his estate, and the obligations of his faith. It was a resource that flowed through his hands rather than accumulating in them. Historical accounts and archaeological finds, such as the Great Queerdale hoard discovered centuries later, revealed just how much currency moved through this world. Such hoards, often buried in times of danger, contain coins from distant lands, telling a silent story of trade, raiding, and tribute. They show that while a man like Leofric might live his entire life on his own lands, he was still connected to a vast and complex economic network that stretched far beyond the boundaries he so carefully walked each spring.
His small chest of silver was one tiny endpoint in a river of metal that flowed across kingdoms. This becomes even clearer when one considers the different kinds of money that circulated in the wider world. Leofric's silver pennies, bearing the image of King Ethelred, were the standard in Wessex. However, a Viking trader arriving on the coast might carry silver dirhams from the great cities of the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East, valued not for their stamp, but purely for their weight and purity. A churchman might speak of the legendary gold solidi of the Byzantine Empire, coins whose quality was so reliable they were accepted as a standard across the known world. Leofric's wealth was therefore local, its value and acceptance defined by the authority of his own king.
Leofric let the coin fall from his fingers, where it landed with a soft clink among the others. He then closed the heavy oak lid, the sound seeming very final in the hall. The act of securing the chest was also an act of setting aside a certain way of thinking. His gaze moved from the iron-bound box toward the open doorway of the hall. Through it, he could see a corner of the muddy yard, and, beyond that, the edge of a field lying fallow for the winter. That land, dark and patient, was the true source of his standing. It produced the food that fed his people, and the wool that clothed them. The loyalty of his reeve, Cynric, and the other men who served him was not something that could be purchased from a chest. It was a bond forged through grants of land, through the promise of protection, and through the shared experience of working the soil and facing the hardships of the seasons together. This web of human relationships, of duties and dependencies, was a far more complex and durable asset than the small pile of metal he had just locked away. It was a living system, one that required constant attention and careful judgment. He pushed the chest back into its shadowed place beneath a bench. The silver was a vital tool, an essential component for navigating the demands of the wider world beyond his manor's boundaries. But it was not, he understood with greater clarity than ever, the measure of his world. That was measured in the health of his livestock, the yield of his fields, and the strength of the community that looked to him for guidance. The small hoard of silver was a clear illustration of how men of this era defined true security through tangible assets and direct obligations, rather than by the mere accumulation of coin.
The small collection of silver pennies in Leofric's chest, while useful for the king's tax, could not solve a more immediate problem growing on his estate. A section of woodland, thick with ancient, stubborn trees, needed to be cleared to create new pasture. The existing axes, while serviceable for smaller tasks, chipped and blunted against the hard oak. What was needed was a new felling axe, one with a head of properly hardened iron, a tool that could only be forged by a true master. Such a craftsman was not found in the quiet countryside, which meant a journey was necessary to the nearest burh, a fortified market town established by the kings to be a center for defense and trade. This undertaking was not a simple errand, but a significant event in itself, illustrating how the simple act of acquiring a quality good was limited by the world itself. The journey began not long after dawn, with Leofric, his reeve Cynric, and 2 strong men from the manor. They traveled not on horseback, which was reserved for warfare or urgent messages, but with a heavy 2-wheeled ox cart for carrying back supplies. Recent spring rains had turned the track into a deep channel of mud. The men's leather boots, carefully greased with tallow for protection, soon became heavy with clinging brown clay. Each step a struggle to pull their feet free from the ground's grip. Progress was painfully slow, measured not in miles, but by the turning of the sun across the sky. The friction of the landscape was a physical force, a constant reminder of the separation between the manor and the wider world. More than once, the cart's wooden wheels sank deep into a soft patch of earth, stopping the oxen in their tracks. When this happened, there was no clever solution, only the application of brute force. The men would unhitch the straining animals, putting their own shoulders to the cart, their faces tight with effort. Cynric's low voice would call out a rhythm, and with a great heave they would push the heavy vehicle forward until it found firmer ground. The sounds of their labored breathing and the deep groan of the wood were the only sounds in the otherwise quiet landscape. This physical struggle was a direct tax on commerce, paid in sweat and time. As they drew closer to the burh of Wareham, the character of the world began to change. The first sign was not something seen, but something heard, a faint, rhythmic clang carried on the breeze. It was the sound of a hammer striking an anvil, a steady beat that spoke of industry and craft. Soon, other sounds joined it, the chatter of many voices speaking in different dialects, the sharp cries of geese being herded to a pen, the rumble of other carts on the more compacted ground near the town's gates. The quiet solitude of the manor was replaced by a lively mix of human activity, a concentration of labor and life that was impossible in the countryside. Upon passing through the tall timber gates set into the town's defensive earthwork walls, the full sensory experience of the burh enveloped them. The air, unlike the clean scent of the fields, carried countless new smells. Wood smoke from dozens of hearths mingled with the sharp, acidic scent of tanning leather from a tanner's yard. From a small hut with a clay oven built against its side came the deeply comforting aroma of baking bread, a smell of community and surplus. Leofric's men, accustomed to the familiar world of the manor, looked around with wide eyes, taking in the sight of people who were not farmers, but merchants, weavers, and craftsmen, all living in close quarters. The source of the rhythmic hammering was a long, low building with an open front, its interior darkened by soot. This was the workshop of the blacksmith. Inside, a large man with arms as thick as small tree branches worked before a glowing forge. He was not one of Leofric's dependents, but a master of his trade, a property owner within the town, and a man whose skills were in high demand. Leofric approached him not as a lord giving a command, but as a customer seeking a service. This was a different kind of social organization, one based on specialized skill rather than the ownership of land. The blacksmith, whose name was Ordgar, stopped his work and looked Leofric over with a practiced eye. He listened to the Thane's request for a felling axe, his expression unreadable in the flickering light of the forge. He picked up a bar of raw iron, weighing it in his hand, and spoke of its quality. This iron, he explained, had come by boat from a land far to the north, and its price was high. The negotiation was a careful dance. Leofric spoke of his need, and Ordgar spoke of the difficulty of the work and the cost of his materials. Here, in this sooty workshop, the Thane's vast fields meant little. The conversation was about a specific tool and the silver required to create it. Eventually, a price was agreed upon. It was a significant sum, enough silver to buy several sheep, but for the right tool, it was a necessary expense. Leofric's silver pennies, so limited in their power on his own land, found their true purpose here as a means of exchange for something he could not produce himself. Ordgar promised the axe would be ready by the next morning. His authority in this matter was absolute. The fire and the iron worked on their own time, and no amount of wealth could rush the process of heating, hammering, and expertly quenching the metal to give it a strong, lasting edge. The growth of these fortified towns was a direct policy of the Anglo-Saxon kings, a way to encourage a new kind of economy and provide secure locations for trade. They were the centers where the kingdom's wealth could be transformed, where raw wool could be woven into cloth, and iron could be shaped into essential tools. Historical accounts indicate that these burhs were strategically placed, often at river crossings or old Roman sites, to serve as hubs for the surrounding countryside. They represented a move toward a more complex society, one not solely defined by the rhythm of the agricultural year. Yet, as Leofric and his men prepared to spend the night in a crowded and noisy guest house, the limitations of this new world were clear. The town was an island of activity in a vast sea of quiet, isolated manners. The brutal difficulty of the journey to reach it meant that trade was not a casual affair, but a major undertaking. The blacksmith's skill was invaluable, but only to those who could endure the journey to his forge. The wealth of the kingdom was growing, but it was concentrated in these small, protected pockets. The next morning, Leofric held the new axe. It was perfectly balanced, the iron head a dark, heavy gray, its edge honed to a sharpness that seemed to hum with potential. It felt solid and powerful in his hands. He paid Ordgar the agreed-upon silver, and the blacksmith accepted it with a simple nod, his attention already turning to the next piece of metal heating in his forge. The transaction was complete, a simple exchange of coin for craft, but it represented a complex web of social and economic forces. The return journey was just as arduous, the heavy axe now carefully packed in straw within the cart. As the sounds of the burr faded behind them, replaced once more by the creak of the wheels and the lowing of the oxen, Leofric reflected on the experience. His wealth gave him the ability to command the labor of men to work his fields, but it took a different kind of power, the concentrated skill of a master craftsman in a protected town, to create the tool needed to expand those fields. These physical and social divisions between the centers of production and the agricultural lands that sustained them help clarify for historians the persistent questions about the true pace and reach of economic change in this era. The journey to the market town had secured the tools needed for the manor's work, but upon returning, Leofric's attention was drawn to a different kind of project. Near the center of the settlement, a new shape was slowly rising against the sky, one made not of familiar timber and wattle, but of solid stone. The old wooden prayer house, which had served the community for generations, was being replaced. This new stone church, a personal undertaking by the Thegn himself, represented an entirely different kind of expenditure, one that explored the profound obligations placed upon a man of his standing. It was a venture that measured wealth not in silver or livestock, but in permanence and piety. The process began miles away, in a shallow pit where the local fieldstone was quarried. This was not a task of great technical skill, but of immense physical effort. Leofric's own men, their backs straining, used iron-tipped wooden levers to pry the heavy, irregular stones from the earth. The sounds of their work were low and rhythmic. The groan of wood under pressure, the sharp crack of splitting rock, and the labored breathing of the workers. These stones, once freed, were loaded onto wooden sledges and dragged by oxen back to the building site. A slow and cumbersome journey that scored deep ruts into the surrounding tracks. This initial phase of the work was a direct tax on the manor's labor, pulling able-bodied men away from the fields and forests where their efforts were always needed. At the construction site itself, a different kind of labor organization was visible. Leofric's workers performed the unskilled tasks, hauling stone, digging foundations, and fetching water. The intricate work of shaping and placing the stones, however, was left to a small group of traveling masons. These were skilled craftsmen, their hands calloused and knowing. With simple tools, a heavy wooden mallet and an iron chisel that required constant resharpening by the local blacksmith, they transformed the rough fieldstones into usable blocks. Each strike of the mallet was precise, chipping away small fragments until a reasonably flat face was achieved. This method, while effective, was incredibly slow, and the progress on the walls could be measured in inches per day. To bind the stones together, a special kind of mortar was prepared. Men heated limestone in a carefully constructed kiln until it glowed, a process that turned the rock into a crumbly substance known as quicklime. This was then slaked with water in a pit, a hazardous task that produced clouds of steam and intense heat. Once cooled, The lime was mixed with sand and water to create a thick, binding paste. The quality of this lime mortar was critical to the strength of the finished building. As a result, its creation was a specialized technical process, overseen by the lead mason who understood the proper ratios and curing times necessary for a durable bond. The materials themselves told a story of cost and status. While the main walls were built from the local stone, solid but difficult to work, Leofric had paid a considerable sum for a different material for the doorway. Several carefully wrapped blocks of a pale, fine-grained stone rested under a covering of thatch. This was cane stone, brought by boat from Normandy, a region in northern France. It was far easier to carve with precision, allowing for the creation of a smooth, elegant arch that would be the church's most prominent feature. The expense of this imported material was a clear and deliberate display of the patron's wealth and his dedication to the project, setting his church apart from more modest structures. As the walls grew higher, the challenge of lifting the heavy stones increased. Without cranes or complex machinery, the builders relied on human muscle and simple ingenuity. They constructed sturdy wooden scaffolding alongside the walls and built long, sloping earthen ramps. Teams of men would then haul the stones up these ramps using ropes and sheer brute force. To ensure the walls rose straight and true, the master mason used a plumb line, a weight suspended from a string, to check their vertical alignment constantly. The entire construction was a testament to cooperative effort and the patient application of foundational engineering principles. This project was a continuous drain on Leofric's resources. He was obligated to provide food and lodging for the skilled masons, whose appetites were sharpened by their hard labor. Their presence meant a noticeable reduction in the manor's stored grain and salted meat. Moreover, this physical investment came on top of a separate, unwavering religious obligation known as the tithe. This was a requirement to give 1/10 of the manor's annual produce, 1 in every 10 sheaves of wheat, 1 in every 10 lambs, 1 in every 10 cheeses, to support the local priest and the broader church organization. This was not a one-time gift, but a permanent tax on his prosperity, making his wealth a public trust as much as a private asset. Contemporary sources note that men of property across the land made such contributions. Charters and wills from the period, those few precious documents that survive, are filled with grants of land and silver to monasteries and churches. Historians who study these records suggest the motivations were complex. While genuine faith was certainly a powerful driver, these acts also secured a family's social standing within the community. A fine stone church was a visible legacy, a permanent marker on the landscape that declared the patron's importance and generosity. It was an investment with an intangible but highly valued return. Leofric often stood watching the slow progress, the rhythmic chink-chink of the chisels, a constant sound across the manor. He would run a hand over the cool, rough texture of the local stone, and then the smooth, almost soft surface of the imported blocks. He saw the sweat on the brows of his men as they heaved another stone up the ramp, and he mentally calculated the cost of the grain being consumed by the masons. The building rising before him was a physical manifestation of his wealth, yet it was a form of wealth he could not spend or trade. It was a conversion of his material assets into something else entirely. The structure was a commitment, a promise made solid. Unlike a chest of silver that could be spent, or a herd of sheep that could be sold, the church was immobile and eternal. It bound him and his descendants to this specific piece of land and this community. In a world where fortunes could be lost to a Viking raid or a bad harvest, this stone building represented a hedge against the short-lived nature of earthly existence. It was a price paid not just for social respect, but for the hope of a legacy that would outlast him, and a soul that might find favor in the next life. This tension between worldly wealth and spiritual obligation was central to the life of a landowner. Leofric's power came from his control of tangible assets, land, labor, and produce. Yet the expectations of his society and his faith required him to divert a significant portion of that wealth toward intangible goals. The rising stone walls were therefore more than just a building. They were the physical evidence of this fundamental constraint on his power, a beautiful and costly monument to the limits of what his riches could truly buy for him in this world. Modern archaeological work on the foundations of small parish churches continues to reveal the immense local effort involved in their creation. The analysis of mortar composition and the sourcing of stone sheds ever more light on the complex economic and spiritual landscapes that shaped these enduring structures. The great project of the stone church was followed by a season of stillness. The summer arrived not with gentle warmth, but with a quiet, persistent dryness. Day after day, the sky remained a pale, cloudless blue, and the earth grew hard underfoot. In the fields, the heads of wheat were thin, the stalks shorter than in years past. Workers moved with a deliberate slowness, their tunics damp with sweat, and they paused often in the shrinking slivers of shade cast by the ancient oaks. Leofric noticed the change not as a single event, but as a slow draining of life from his lands. The constant need for water was a presence in his throat, a dryness that no drink could fully quench, mirroring the thirst of the very soil that defined his standing. This growing concern for his crops was soon overshadowed by a more immediate problem. The small river that marked the boundary between his lands and those of a neighboring thegn, a proud man named Ethelred, had dwindled. Where it once flowed with a cheerful sound over smooth stones, it was now a shallow, sluggish stream. While walking the boundary with his reeve, Cynric, Leofric saw something that made him stop. On the far bank, well within Etheled's territory, a team of men was at work. They were not tending crops or mending fences. They were digging, their spades cutting into the earth with a rhythmic, determined scrape. A new channel, a raw wound in the land, was being cut from the river angling away toward Ethelred's parched fields. The confrontation that followed was not one of drawn swords, but of heated words spoken across the shallow water. Leofric, with Cynric and 2 of his own men, stood on his side of the bank, while Ethelred approached with his own workers. There was no formal law, no written deed to consult about the flow of a river. The entire argument rested on custom, on what had always been done. Leofric argued that the river was a shared boundary, its water a shared resource for generations. To divert its flow was to steal the life from his land. The air between them was tense, and the men on both sides watched their lords, their hands resting near the knives at their belts, a silent promise of violence if words should fail. Ethelred, his face hardened by the same sun that baked his fields, did not deny the act. Instead, he defended it with the grim logic of desperation. His own people were thirsty, his crops were failing, and his livestock were growing thin. Was he to stand by and watch his wealth wither while the water trickled past, simply to honor a custom that was never designed for a drought this severe? His argument revealed a fundamental truth of this era. Wealth, even when measured in vast acres, was utterly dependent on environmental forces that no amount of silver or authority could command. The dispute showed that in times of scarcity, the bonds of neighborly custom could become dangerously thin. This impasse highlighted the very structure of local power. Leofric could not simply appeal to a distant king's court to solve such a matter. Justice was local, personal, and rooted in reputation and the ability to enforce one's will. However, direct conflict with another Thegn was a costly and unpredictable business, a path both men were reluctant to take. As their voices grew louder, a new figure appeared, walking slowly from the direction of the new church. It was Father Elston, the local priest, his presence immediately lowering the tension. He spoke not of land rights, but of the sin of conflict between Christian men and the need for a solution that would prevent ruin for everyone. The negotiation that followed, mediated by the priest, was a fragile and difficult affair. It was held right there on the riverbank, with the sun making the participants squint and the dry earth reflecting the warmth. The solution was not a victory for either side, but a carefully managed compromise. Ethelred would be allowed a small diversion of water, marked by a large stone placed in the new channel, but only for a set number of hours each day. It was an agreement sealed not by a document, but by a sworn oath before the priest. This arrangement, based entirely on spoken words and shared oversight, demonstrated how communities had to create their own legal frameworks to manage crises when no higher authority was available. Even with the truce in place, Leofric felt a shift inside him. The world seemed less certain than it had at the start of the summer. The threat had come not from Viking raiders or a king's tax, but from a neighbor driven by the same needs as his own people. His wealth was only as secure as the rainfall and the goodwill of the men who lived just beyond his boundaries. That night, sleep did not come easily. He lay awake listening to the sounds of the manor, every creak of the timber hall sounding like a potential threat. The experience had planted a seed of insecurity that began to grow into a plan for action. The next morning, he gave the order. The work in the fields would have to wait. Every able-bodied man was to turn his attention to the manor's defenses. The primary task was to deepen the ditch that encircled the main hall and its outbuildings. The process was grueling. The ground, baked hard by weeks without rain, resisted their iron-tipped spades. The sound of metal striking unyielding earth and the grunts of exertion from the workers echoed across the quiet landscape. This technical process was simple in concept, but required immense physical effort, a direct conversion of his people's labor into a physical barrier against a newly perceived danger. In addition to deepening the ditch, Leofric directed the reinforcement of the timber palisade, the tall wooden fence that stood on the inner edge of the moat. His men felled several young oak trees, their wood chosen for its strength and durability. They split the trunks into rough posts, sharpening one end to a point. These new timbers were then driven into the ground between the existing ones, closing gaps and strengthening the overall structure. The rhythmic thud of heavy wooden mallets driving the posts into the earth became the new sound of the manor, a grim and steady beat that spoke of a new, more cautious era. This work was a physical manifestation of Leofric's realization. His land, his livestock, and his silver were all vulnerable. His authority rested not just on managing his assets, but on his capacity to defend them from threats both seen and unseen. The palisade was more than just a wall of wood. It was a statement of his intent to protect what was his, a necessary investment in a world where a dry season could turn a neighbor into a rival. The manor was transforming from a center of production into a fortified position. As the men worked, Leofric stood watching them, his gaze fixed on the reinforced wall. The dispute over the river, a conflict without a single drop of bloodshed, had been a more profound lesson than any raid. It showed that the greatest threats were not always the most dramatic. Sometimes they were as quiet and slow as a river drying up in the summer heat. The fragile truce, recorded only in the memory of those who stood on the riverbank that day, speaks to a system of local justice that legal historians continue to piece together from charters and ancient law codes, trying to understand how order was maintained in a world of scarce resources. The poor harvest from the long, dry summer left a quiet anxiety hanging over the manor. Work continued, but movements were more measured, conversations more subdued, as every household took stock of what little they had to see them through the coming winter. The difficult negotiations over water with the neighboring fen, Aethelred, had settled into a tense, watchful peace, but the baked earth and withered crops were a constant reminder of the year's fragility. It was into this quiet apprehension that a new sound broke the afternoon calm, the frantic, desperate drumming of a horse's hooves, ridden hard along the track that led from the main road. This was not the steady pace of a merchant or a traveler, but the sound of urgent news. Every head in the nearby fields turned. Men leaned on their tools, their faces betraying a mix of curiosity and unease. The rider did not slow as he approached the manor's timber palisade, pulling his lathered horse to a jarring halt only at the main gate. He was a stranger, his cloak gray with road dust and his face streaked with sweat despite the cooling autumn air. He dismounted stiffly, his body showing the strain of a long and punishing ride. He was a messenger from the local ealdorman, the powerful nobleman who governed the entire region for the king, and his arrival immediately drew Cynric, the reeve, from the main All. The gravity of the situation was clear. Such men did not ride so hard to deliver good news.
Inside the hall, the messenger stood before Leofric, declining an offer of ale, his duty taking precedence over his thirst. The central fire pit cast long, dancing shadows on the timber walls as he unrolled a small piece of parchment, its edges sealed with the ealdorman's mark in beeswax. The message was not a request for men or a summons to a local council. It was a blunt and unavoidable demand, relayed on behalf of King Ethelred, a monarch whose reputation for indecisive leadership was already spreading through the land. The demand was for a tax, but not the usual tithe of grain or livestock. This was a call for silver, a special levy known as the heargeld. This tax was a direct and devastating drain on the very heart of a lord's portable wealth. The word heargeld translates to army tax, but everyone knew its true purpose. It was not to pay for an English army to fight, but to pay tribute to the Viking raiders who were harrying the coasts, a desperate bribe to persuade them to leave the kingdom in peace. Leofric listened, his face like stone, as the amount was stated. It was a ruinous sum, a significant portion of the silver he kept locked in his iron-bound chest. This event showed with brutal clarity how political instability at the highest level, in the king's distant court, could reach down with an iron fist and cripple a local lord who had done everything right by the standards of his own world. Leofric stood motionless for a long moment after the messenger finished, the crackle of the fire the only sound in the suddenly silent hall. His jaw was tight, the muscles working beneath the skin. His gaze, heavy and unblinking, shifted from the tired face of the messenger to the anxious expressions of his own men who stood along the walls, looking to him for a response, for strength. He felt the sharp bitterness of his own powerlessness. He could face down a rival Thegn over a water dispute and defend his land from local threats, but he could not defy the king's tax collector. To refuse was to be branded a traitor, inviting the wrath of the ealdorman and the king himself, a conflict that would destroy everything he had built.
He found himself trapped by the very wealth he commanded. His land and his people made him prominent, but that prominence made him a target for the king's desperate need for coin. There was no choice here, only the illusion of one. With a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to carry an immense physical weight, he gave a single stiff nod of assent. The command, inescapable and ruinous, settled upon him and his people. His authority on his own land, which had seemed so absolute just a morning before, was now revealed to be conditional, subject to the failures of a distant and faltering government. The reasons for this deep vulnerability are well understood from historical accounts of the period. King Ethelred's realm lacked a strong, permanent, professional army capable of meeting the Viking threat head-on across a long and exposed coastline. Instead of a sustained military response, the King's Council repeatedly resorted to a policy of appeasement, paying vast sums of silver to buy temporary peace. This strategy was not only ruinously expensive, draining the kingdom of its precious metals, but it was also ultimately ineffective. The payments simply encouraged the raiders to return in subsequent years, demanding ever larger sums. Leofric's personal wealth, so carefully managed and protected, was now subject to the consequences of these flawed national policies. The silver in his chest represented security, the ability to purchase high-quality iron for tools, to trade for salt, essential for preserving meat through the winter, or to hire a skilled craftsman when needed. Now, a large part of that security was to be handed over to pay for a king's political weakness. It was a clear and painful example of the interconnectedness of power and prosperity, where the fortunes of a manor in Wessex were directly tied to strategic decisions made hundreds of miles away. The collection of the tax was a somber affair. Leofric unlocked the small wooden chest himself, the iron hinges groaning in the quiet hall. He and Cynric counted out the silver pennies, their surfaces dull in the firelight. These were not the uniform coins of a later age. Each was a thin, hammered disc of silver, stamped with the king's image, but varying slightly in weight and shape. The coins made a soft, metallic whisper as they were poured from a leather pouch into the weighing scales. Each clink was the sound of a winter provision not purchased, a necessary repair not made, a future plan abandoned. This quiet, personal loss being experienced by Leofric was, in reality, a microcosm of a much larger national crisis. In halls and manors all across England, other Thegns were doing the same, surrendering the liquid capital of their estates. Period documents and coin hoards discovered by archaeologists tell a stark story of this massive outflow of wealth. The heargeld was a crushing burden on the English economy, weakening the very class of local lords who formed the backbone of the kingdom's defenses and administration. It was a slow bleeding of the nation's strength, a policy that would have profound consequences. Many historians argue that the repeated payment of these tributes was a major factor in the eventual conquest of England by the Danes in the following decades. It not only depleted the country's financial resources, but also damaged the morale and loyalty of the king's subjects. A lord's duty was to protect his people, but how could he do that when his own king was seizing the means of that protection? The policy created a cycle of decline. The tax weakened the local lords, making the kingdom more vulnerable, which in turn led to more raids and the need for even higher taxes. Leofric watched as the counted silver was placed into a heavy leather sack and sealed by the messenger. The man, his duty done, finally accepted a drink of water before preparing for his return journey. He was merely an instrument of a vast and impersonal system, a system that now held Leofric's prosperity in its grip. The wealth that came from the land, from the living herds, from the careful management of people and resources, had proven insufficient to guard against the demands of a frightened king. The most tangible forms of his power had been overcome by a threat he could neither fight nor negotiate with. This forced surrender to a distant authority reveals a universal tension between the wealth one can build and the stability of the larger world that allows it to exist. The autumn winds arrived with a fury that year, a constant rushing sound that made the timbers of the great hall groan like an old man rising from his chair. Rain came not in drops, but in sheets, turning the hard-baked earth of the manor yard into a slick brown mud. Inside, people kept close to the central fire pit, the dancing flames a small comfort against the deep moans of the wind working its way through every unseen crack in the walls. Then, on the second night of the gale, a sound tore through the din of the storm, a sharp, violent crack like a giant bone snapping, followed by a heavy, shuddering thud that seemed to shake the very ground. The next morning, under a sky washed clean and pale, the source of the noise was distressingly clear. A massive limb from the ancient oak near the river had been torn away, and it had fallen directly upon the small, turf-roofed building that housed the manor's watermill. The silence that followed the storm was, in its own way, more unsettling than the noise had been. For years, the rhythmic, low rumble of the millstones had been a constant presence, the heartbeat of the estate. Now, there was nothing. Leofric stood with his reeve, Cynric, staring at the damage. The roof was crushed, but that was simple work to repair. The true disaster lay inside. The main shaft was splintered, and the complex wooden gearing that transferred the power of the water wheel to the grinding stones was a tangle of broken teeth and shattered spokes. Cynric, a man who could mend a plow or set a fence post with practiced ease, simply shook his head, his face grim. The manor's own carpenters possessed the same skills. They could build a barn, but they could not shape the intricate, precisely interlocking parts of this vital machine. This particular challenge laid bare a new and unfamiliar limit to Leofric's authority. The silver pennies locked in his iron-bound chest were useless here. They could not buy the knowledge needed to measure and cut the gears. His land, the very foundation of his standing, offered no solution. He could command 100 men to dig a ditch or harvest a field, but he could not command a single one of them to understand the hidden geometry of the mill's mechanism. The meager harvest from the dry summer, now waiting to be ground, sat in the granary as a silent testament to his powerlessness. For the first time, Leofric confronted a problem that could not be solved by wealth or status, but only by a specific and rare kind of human skill. Consequently, riders were sent out, not with demands for taxes or summons for war, but with a simple, urgent inquiry. They rode to the nearest fortified town, and then to the larger monasteries, asking for anyone who knew the craft of a millwright. The search itself demonstrated the immense value of this specialized knowledge. Such men were not fixtures of a single manor. They were itinerant, traveling from one estate to another, their skills a form of capital more mobile than land and more practical than silver. Days turned into a week, and a nervous quiet settled over the manor. The women of the village resorted to grinding grain by hand with small, laborious stone querns, a slow process that produced coarse flour and frayed tempers. Their rhythmic scraping was a constant, grating reminder of the broken technology by the river. Eventually, a man named Eadwig arrived on foot, leading a donkey laden with heavy leather rolls. He was not a large man, and his clothes were plain and dusty from the road, but he carried himself with an unshakable confidence that immediately set him apart. He did not bow deeply to Leofric, but offered a simple nod of respect, his eyes already scanning the broken mill house. In that moment, the entire social structure of the manor was quietly inverted. Leofric, the powerful Thegn, became a client seeking a service. Eadwig, a man with no land to his name, was the master. He walked around the wreckage, running a calloused thumb over a splintered cog, his expression unreadable. After a long silence, he looked at Leofric and named his price. A decent sum in silver, yes, but also a warm place to sleep through the winter, a new wool cloak, and 2 measures of the manor's best ale every evening until the work was done. Once the terms were agreed upon, Eadwig's authority became absolute. He directed Leofric's men with quiet, clear commands, his voice never rising, but expecting immediate obedience. The first step was not to clear the wreckage, but to find the right material for the repair. Eadwig led Cynric deep into the woods, ignoring perfectly good oak and ash trees. He was searching for hornbeam, a wood so hard and dense it was often called ironwood. He would tap the trunks with a small mallet, listening to the sound, explaining that the wood for gear teeth had to be from a tree that grew slowly on high ground, ensuring a tight, resilient grain. This was knowledge passed down not in books, but from master to apprentice, a living tradition of craft that existed entirely outside the formal structures of the church or the nobility. The technical process of the repair was a source of constant fascination for the people of the manor. Eadwig unrolled his tools, a collection of specialized augers, saws, and chisels that the local carpenters eyed with a mixture of envy and respect. For the great lantern pinion gear, the part that looked like a wooden cage, he selected a seasoned piece of oak. With immense precision, he used a compass-like tool to mark out the design, then bored the holes for the vertical staves or rungs of the gear. His movements were slow, deliberate, and economical. There was no wasted effort. The air in the rebuilt mill house now carried the sharp, clean scent of cut wood, and the only sounds were the gentle rasp of the saw and the rhythmic tock-tock-tock of Eadwig's mallet on a chisel handle. He was not merely repairing a machine, he was imposing a new order on the raw material, shaping it to his will. This reliance on traveling experts is something that historians who study the technology of the era often point to. Monastic records and estate accounts frequently mention payments to specialists. not just millwrights, but also master masons, bell founders, and glaziers. These accounts suggest an economy far more complex and interconnected than one might assume. It was a system where human capital, the knowledge held in a person's head and hands, was a crucial commodity. Edwig represented this hidden network of skill that held the medieval world together. He was a living library of practical knowledge, and for as long as he worked on the mill, his value to Leofric's community was greater than that of any single knight or acre of land. Finally, the day came when the new gears were fitted into place. The main shaft was set, the teeth of the different wheels were meshed together, and Edwig made final, tiny adjustments with a small wooden wedge here, a tap of his mallet there. A crowd gathered at a respectful distance. Under Edwig's direction, Leofric's men opened the sluice gate. Water, dark and cold, rushed along the channel, struck the paddles of the great wheel, and with a groan of new wood settling against old, the entire mechanism began to move. The wheel turned, the main shaft rotated, the gears engaged, and inside the mill house, the heavy upper stone began its slow, powerful rotation over the bedstone. A cheer went up as Cynric poured the first bag of grain into the hopper, and a moment later, a fine white stream of flour trickled into the collection bin. The manor's heartbeat had returned, stronger than before. These insights into the essential role of specialized labor help complete our understanding of the period's economic foundations. The year's cycle was drawing to a close as the days grew shorter and the wind carried a new chill from the north. Inside the main hall, the central fire pit was the heart of the world, its flames pushing back the encroaching twilight and casting long, dancing shadows against the timber walls. Thegn Leofric sat on a heavy wooden bench, a smoothed piece of ash wood resting on his knees. In his hand, he held a stick of charcoal, its tip making sharp, black marks that recorded the state of his estate. The scratch of the charcoal on the wood was a quiet sound against the crackle of burning logs and the low murmur of his household seeking warmth. This was his reckoning, a tally not of coin, but of survival and loss. Each mark represented a memory from the preceding seasons. He drew a line for the sheep lost to sickness in the spring, a shorter mark for the lambs that survived, and his hand paused as he recalled the tense days of watching his living wealth dwindle. Following this, he etched a series of symbols representing the sacks of grain from the harvest, a yield diminished by the long, dry summer. The memory of the parched earth and the dispute over the dwindling river with his neighbor, Athelred, caused his grip on the charcoal to tighten. That conflict, settled not with silver, but with hard words and fragile agreements, had been a stark reminder that the boundaries of his land meant little if the sky would not provide rain. These physical assets were subject to forces far beyond his control. His gaze then moved to a separate section of the tally board, a space reserved for the silver pennies. Here, the marks were few and deeply scored into the wood, representing a profound and painful outflow. The largest single mark was for the king's tax, the hergeld, a payment to pacify distant sea raiders. Leofric could still feel the phantom weight of the silver leaving his hands, a treasure that offered no security, only a temporary reprieve from a threat he had never seen. This payment to a far-off king had weakened him more than any local feud. It had drained the one resource that was meant for trade and emergencies, yet it could not mend a broken mill or guarantee the loyalty of a man's heart. This thought brought him to another mark, smaller, but just as significant: the payment given to Edwig, the traveling millwright. Recalling this expense brought no bitterness. He remembered the craftsman's sure hands and the quiet authority with which he had directed Leofric's own men. The silver paid to him was an exchange for knowledge, for a skill that had turned a useless pile of timber and stone back into a working machine, essential for feeding his people. The restored turning of the millstone, grinding the meager harvest into life-sustaining flour, was a far more tangible return on his silver than any tribute paid to a king. The experience had reordered his understanding of value. A skilled hand could be worth more than a chest of coins. From this reflection on individual skill, his attention shifted to the larger community under his care. He looked up from the tally board, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of the hall. He saw the faces of the Gabors, the families who worked his lands in exchange for their homes and protection. Their own small plots had suffered terribly in the drought, and he could see the worry etched into their features, a deep concern about the coming winter months. The strength of his manner, he understood, with a clarity sharpened by the year's trials, was not in its palisade walls or the number of hides he controlled. It resided in the well-being of these people, in their ability to work the land come spring. With this realization settling upon him, he set the board aside. He called over his reeve, Cynric, a man whose stern face showed the same anxieties as his own. Leofric's voice was low but clear, carrying easily through the hall. He gave an instruction that was simple, yet it overturned decades of custom. A larger portion of the flour from the manor's own stores was to be set aside, not for sale, but for distribution among the families whose personal harvests had failed. It was not charity, but a pragmatic investment in the human foundation of his wealth. A well-fed worker was a strong worker, and their survival was his own. Cynric nodded slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to a deep, unspoken understanding. He had managed Leofric's lands for many years, counting every seed and measuring every day of labor. But this command was different. It was an act that looked beyond the immediate accounting of gains and losses, toward the long, uncertain horizon of the year to come. As the reeve moved off to see the order was carried out, Leofric felt a sense of rightness in the decision. It was a choice born from the hard lessons of a year that had challenged every assumption he held about his own power and prosperity. He then gave a second order, instructing a young lad to prepare a small bundle. It was to contain a side of cured meat and a roll of fine wool cloth. This was not a payment, but a gift to be sent to the millwright Edwig in the nearby burh. It was a gesture to maintain a valuable relationship, to ensure that if a vital piece of machinery broke again, the skilled hands needed to fix it would remember Leofric's manner with favor. He was learning that true influence was woven from threads of obligation and mutual respect, a fabric far stronger and more flexible than simple command. Finally, Leofric walked to the heavy wooden door of the hall and pulled it open just enough to look out into the night. The wind had died down, and the first delicate snowflakes of winter were beginning to drift from a dark sky, settling silently on the dormant fields. He was not a king directing armies, nor a merchant counting gold in a distant city. He was a custodian of the land and its people, a manager of a complex system of resources and relationships. The security he possessed was not an absolute hoard to be guarded, but a fragile balance he had to actively maintain day after day. The material accounts and personal records from this era of profound change continue to provide scholars with a deeper comprehension of the enduring connections between resources, community, and genuine security. And so, our journey through the year 985 comes to a gentle close. We leave behind the Lord in his stone hall, his coffers heavy with silver, yet unable to purchase a swift cure for a fever or a guarantee of a safe voyage for a loved one. His wealth could secure the finest wool blankets, but it couldn't banish the deep, quiet dark of a world without manufactured light, nor could it quiet a worried mind. These limitations remind us of the simple, profound comforts that transcend time. The greatest of these, perhaps, is the universal solace of rest. So let the concerns of our own era soften and fade, just as the candlelight would have yielded to the night in that distant past. May you find a peace tonight that no medieval fortune could ever procure. Sleep well, and let the quiet corridors of history lead you to deep and tranquil dreams.